Oh, the very cold is gnawing my bones. Oh, just one more door. Look, through the keyhole here.
Hello? What is the meaning of this?
Good evening, sir. We've come to spread the good word.
There'll be no good words around here. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
but we've come to sing you a song.
What? No, do not
God
sing.
rest ye merry listeners, let nothing you dismay. Remember the Lit and Lang gang records upon this day to save us all from rubbish crates, despite what you might say. Oh, tidings of grade 8s and 9s, grade 8s and 9s. Oh, tidings
That is
of grade-
enough. Thank you very much. I'll be off with you, little Langan. Bah, humbug, and a good afternoon.
Oh, I guess we should have stuck to the original. What is the original sound?
Cracking conversation, analytical interpretation, and igniting imagination with a little Langan.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lit and Lang gang. Sorry, Mr. Grimmett was cradling his skull. I don't even know what happened.
I was preparing myself. I don't know why I was doing that. I'm sorry. Carry on.
Where this half term we're going to be talking about A Christmas Carol. Now, if you were in year 11, hopefully this will form some of your revision as you approach your final exams at the end of this year. But at the same time, we're doing this now because year 10 are currently studying this. So you can start to get ahead of the game a little bit. Today we're going to be talking about Stave 1, which is really chapter 1 of A Christmas Carol. And we're going to be talking you through, in sections, Scrooge and his acquaintances, so Scrooge and the other characters, and then in the second section we're going to be talking about why Scrooge is presented that way and the big ideas surrounding that and what Dickens had intended. But, of course, I'm not expecting that you're going to remember the entire storyline of A Christmas Carol. So we have got a little challenge today, and it's Mr. Grimmett in the hot seat. Maybe that's why you're nervous.
Oh, that's why I'm
you're
nervous.
nervous.
You look like you're going to puke.
Yes. Oh, sorry. With us today, you have me, Miss Graham.
And me, Miss Battiste.
And, obviously,
Mr. Grimmett.
Yeah, okay.
Mr. Grimmett is looking very pink. So the intention here is we are going to set a 30-second timer on Mr. Grimmett, and he's going to have 30 seconds to tell you. I mean, really, without looking at the book, that's surely cheating.
Cheater.
I'll put the book out. I'll close the book.
Close the book. 30 seconds to tell you what happens in Stave 1.
What happens in Stave 1?
Are you ready?
Go.
Go.
Okay, Marley was dead to begin with. After that, we learn about Scrooge. He's walking along the streets of London. Oh, people don't like him. Even dogs don't like him. He's such a miserable guy. And then he's sat in his counting house, and he's got a little fire. And so Bob scratches his fire even smaller because he's really selfish about it. I'm halfway through already. Oh my god! Fred comes in, asks him Cherry. He doesn't want to go to Cherry. Not even Cherry. What? He doesn't want to go to his house for Christmas dinner. We're going to need to make this longer, to 40 seconds. And then he goes, "Good afternoon. Go away. Bye bye." And then the charity collectors come in. They don't. They ask him for money. He doesn't give them any. He basically tells Bob Cratchit he can go home for Christmas. Then he comes and shouts, tells. No, I literally
Stop.
finished it.
That's 40 seconds.
That's the
That was
worst.
40 seconds.
If you didn't spend so much time going, it might be all right.
I spent longer talking about a dog than I did about anything else. That was terrible.
To be honest, I think next week, if we've got someone else in the hot seat, we're going to realise that is really hard. You're halfway through.
You did a good job.
Because you did the whole
I did
Bob
not do a
Cratchit.
good job. Do not tell me that I did.
Hey, we're trying to be
Right.
optimistic.
What went
Yeah,
well,
true.
you got through half of the stage. Next step, finish the task you were given. So, the only bits I think you missed out really is because you did Bob Cratchit, you did Fred, you did Scrooge and his horrible nature. Really, it was just sort of Marley and the supernatural when he gets home.
Yeah, because when he gets home, everything changes. The book moves from what seems to be quite a normal storyline to something that's a bit more sinister and a bit more dark, and the audience would be like,
Absolutely,
ooh,
yeah.
what's
And
going on here?
supernatural as well, because it
Yeah.
would have been quite supernatural. Brilliant. Well done, Mr. Grimmett. Okay, so you might have heard this sounds a little bit more professional because we have definitely got this
Are
down
we not
into...
doing the jingle for this bit?
Well, I was going to get there, but thanks for cutting over.
Oh, was it really?
Well, no, there is
Shall
a
we just stop
sound
this
effect
again?
that I will put in
It's
there.
awful.
And then I was going to say, now we're going to go on to the first section of this, which is about Scrooge and his acquaintances. And then Miss Battiste was going to go,
Scrooge and friends. Dun, dun, dun.
but you ruined it.
But you ruined it. As
Oh, by the way, I feel we need to also highlight here, we are not friends. I just want to highlight, one of my year 10 said to me, oh, it must be really nice to record the podcast because you get to sit with your friends. And I was like, oh, I wouldn't call Mr. Grimmett a friend.
Yeah,
Once we press stop, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
That is it.
That is
it's damaging to
Don't
our
even,
reputation.
don't even say goodbye. Just leave
I like
straight
Miss
away.
Battiste, but Mr. Grimmett, not really not sure I would call you a friend, but year 10 think we're friends.
We're going to talk about friends. We're going to talk about acquaintances because Scrooge doesn't have any friends either.
No, just like Mr. Grimmett. So,
Yeah. Go on.
so Scrooge himself, I mean, what you will find is we're basically going to track him through these podcasts and how he sounds and how he comes across and his actions. But really, I suppose the thing we need to note with Scrooge at the beginning is that he is icy. He's frosty. And I think the amount of ice imagery that is in this stave is shocking, really.
Oh, God, yeah. He's miserable. He's absolutely miserable from the get-go. And we don't feel any sympathy for him as a character. We're set up pretty much to hate him from the get-go because of the way he behaves. The fact that he does business on his only, sole mourner, the sole proprietor, his sole benefactor, his best friend, if you want to use that term loosely. The fact that he works on his funeral, the day of his funeral, we don't like him. And there's a lot of negative imagery towards him, and that kind of starts with that ice and the fact that he's got a casing around himself. He's created this.
He kept a low temperature about him or something like that, isn't it? He kept his own low temperature.
He kept his own throughout the year. Yeah.
I think the foul weather doesn't know where to have him, and not even cold weather can chill him.
Because he's actually beyond that point, isn't he? He's so iced over and so frosty that actually the extreme cold has no effect on ice.
The ice not going to get any worse. His old features. There's something like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's something like that. It's also interesting that it's almost like London itself is also
London's lost.
Lost as well. So it's I feel like it's not Dickens saying that just this mad Scrooge is like this. You have a lot of London is lost.
Well, Scrooge isn't an isolated character. I mean, I know, literally, he isolates himself, but Scrooge is representative of something much bigger. He's representative of the society as a whole, isn't he? I mean, we were talking in the masterclass this week about how the third ghost, which we'll talk about when we get there, but he always refers to him as man because that's what he is. He represents mankind.
That's right.
Yeah, we were talking about this with my year 10s today, and this idea that he represents everything that's wrong with society. And so, yes, he's lost in the fog. There's so much fog between the houses, and his little counting house is kind of lost in the middle of all that.
I like that idea about it being lost. Fred also points out that Christmas time is a time where people who usually have closed off hearts open up their shut up hearts freely. So Dickens is saying here that, again, it's not just Scrooge, it's a lot of people. Well, everyone closes themselves off.
Yeah, and he is being incredibly negative on one side, but he's also being incredibly hopeful. If you dig down and look at the imagery and things like that, he compares him to Flint and he compares him to an oyster, which are both very negative. Don't get me wrong, nobody wants to be compared to a rock or a very closed up kind of clam.
I do, but
that's just you. But there is hope in both of those images because Flint has the ability to spark fire. It just needs to be struck with the right thing. And oysters have the ability to have pearls, which are quite valuable. They're just hidden deep within. So even behind all of its negativity towards the beginning, there is hope. There is hope for that society.
One of my students said as well, with that solitary is an oyster quotation, that it's quite interesting. It's almost like oysters are protecting something quite precious. And almost we hear that and we think negative, solitary, shut up, deep in the ocean. But
and
at the same time,
are ugly.
And they're ugly. But at the same time, is it almost like guarding something,
well, and
like a self-protection?
It can foreshadow what has actually happened to him in his past and
Absolutely.
things like that.
Yeah.
So there's more to be said there.
I think, and as we get into Stave 2, we'll kind of uncover those things.
Yeah.
When kind of linking to Fred there, you talked about him symbolising ice, or the semantic field of ice being used a lot to describe him. With Fred, it's very much the opposite. Fred's has ruddy cheeks, he's got sparkling eyes, his breath smokes, so he's got all of these
all in a glow.
all in a glow.
And he
absolutely.
cuts through the fog.
He does cut through the fog, and he's like a breath of fresh air, isn't he? He's bright and cheerful, juxtaposing with Scrooge's melancholy
misery.
darkness and misery.
And
absolutely.
It's also that he represents the Christmas spirit in its entirety, doesn't he? He's he is everything you would want at that time of year. He is generous, he is kind, he is good, he is charitable. And obviously, by extension, the complete opposite. They are foil characters, aren't they, Scrooge and Fred?
Yes,
Absolutely. And it just points out as well the idiocy behind Scrooge's arguments, because he hates Christmas. Yeah, no Like, you can't argue with that. But he actually can't argue back with Fred. They're presenting two sides of an argument where he's like, oh, well, why do you hate Christmas? You're poor and all this. Everything Fred has to say back to him is valid, and it gets to the point where
he often replies with like "bar humbug" or "good afternoon,"
because he doesn't have anything
out.
else to say.
And it's also, it shows what he could have been. I mean, Fred literally says to him, like, we've had no quarrel. There's nothing wrong here. I just want you to come to Christmas. Fred has obviously tried this numerous times, and there's no reason for it. And he could have been this loving uncle. I mean, you know, we'll talk to Stave too, but is it actually that he finds Fred's company too painful?
Possibly.
Possibly so. But either way, Scrooge is making a decision with all of this. I think there's at no point where you can say, well, that's just who Scrooge is. It's in his nature to be like that. It's not.
Well, and again, society making decisions about what Christianity looks like, what charity looks like, and things like that. It's all impacted.
So if he's representing society in that way. So when the charity collectors come in and ask for money, when Dickens has Scrooge decline, say no,
decline is a very polite saying.
Decline extremely negatively.
Are there no prisons?
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? That's a direct reference to the state of things at the time, when people tended not to give to charity because poor people did have the workhouses to go to, but of course we know that they were terrible.
Well, yeah, and he uses the term idle as well. Like, he finds them idle, and that would be reflected in that society's view that you're poor because you're lazy or you're not doing what you should do, which relates directly to Mathis, whose paper at the time, if you actually sit down and look at that paper, it is a lot of really long words, like, don't get me wrong, but he actually says things like those of worthy status, and the words that they tend to use. So they really would feel that the lower classes, as people who are poor, were poor because of themselves, which wasn't correct, and they needed to be educated on that.
Yeah, and Dickens knew that, of course, because he went through poverty at a young age, so he knew.
I think it's important to note that we often associate these writers with very fortuitous backgrounds and good lifestyles because, let's face it, you know, I suppose that's what we associate with authors today, and they have access to education stuff. But actually, no, that wasn't the case. Dickens, like you were saying, experienced real poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think he experienced, you know, middle class life, but also poverty, and he had the education to kind of use his knowledge.
He worked in that factory and hated it. They also lived in a prison, didn't they? Because his father went to prison. They lived in the prison for a time as well, so he knew what it was like.
So after that, he begrudgingly gives Bob Cratchit the day off for Christmas, but not happily.
Dare he?
And Bob Cratchit skips down.
I love the comparison of the way Cratchit with nothing, no money, and he skips home. He slides, doesn't he, down the hill or something like that?
Yeah, slides on
home for Christmas to what is his home life like. But Scrooge goes and has his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern.
Yes. Yeah, and he's alone. And he's alone the whole time.
Yeah, he has reasons.
And there's a lot
happy.
of imagery of death and things like that. Like, he's got some sort of chest infection or something. He's eating a gruel when he goes home because he's not feeling well. And even after he sees Marley's face in the knocker, there's so much imagery of death, like the stairwell being big enough for a hearse to go up, and he feels like he sees a hearse go up the steps in front of him.
Well, Miss Goff has a theory that, again, it's only a theory, that Scrooge was meant to die that night.
Absolutely. I feel like that as well.
He was saved and redeemed because with the spirits he took that lesson, and I think had he not had learned that,
it would have
the
been
Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come would have been
this is it, mate.
The next day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I feel like that's the same as well. I feel like where everything's happening in that one night, it is like that Judgment Day, which kind of fits into the idea of Christianity and what it means to be a good Christian. And you get to like St. Peter's Gates and look in the book and make sure that you're a good person before you're allowed in. He wouldn't have been allowed in. So having this judgment almost and seeing if he can change is his last chance.
Absolutely.
I think we shouldn't ignore as well, just before we kind of move on, the pathetic fallacy of the chapter. So it's such thick fog. It is freezing cold and thick fog that you can't see. It says something like the streets were narrow and the buildings opposite were mere phantoms.
Yeah.
So, I mean, foreshadowing a ghostly spirit, isn't it? But at the same time, fog is mystery and deception and I don't know, what's the word?
It's ignorance as well.
Yeah,
it's not being able to see what's truly happening, and by the end
The fog
in
lifts.
Stave 5, the fog does lift.
Yeah,
You
the
can
Christmas
see
days
things.
Yeah,
cheery,
bright
isn't
and
it?
clear,
It
isn't
definitely might be Dickens pointing out that London, like society, is lost. It's lost in the fog. Scrooge is lost in the fog. He's just happy in his little counting house because he's ignorant of everything out and around and outside of him. And it's not like characters until you've got Fred and Bob who actually move about in the fog that have so much more of an optimistic, happy.
They move
atmosphere.
easier, don't they?
They do,
Because
don't
Fred
they?
Fred parts the fog almost, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I think he
Bob's-
walks so fast or something that he gets
Yeah.
hot
Yeah.
by the time that he arrives.
Yeah.
So he almost makes his own heat and happiness just through
Yeah.
the
And
way
you've-
that he behaves.
And you got Bob, who, as you say, like slides and skids and has fun, and then you got Scrooge, who's literally like clasping at the walls because he can't. Like
'Cause
when
he
he's
can't
trying to find
see.
his front door, he's like following the walls, isn't he?
Yeah.
Right.
I think we should just very quickly talk about the door knocker and Marley arriving. We haven't really touched on him.
Well, Marley, I think because we're so used to seeing the Muppets version or watching this at Christmas, and it is a happy story, really, but you do forget that Marley is a symbol of absolute horror.
His
So
jaw falls off.
His jaw literally falls off. He would be the epitome of people's fear. Like
Yeah,
he is
the
like
dead coming back. The
dead
Victorians
coming
are
back.
terrified.
He's tied down. He can't go to heaven. He's in some sort of heat coming up, isn't he? Because his
hair is moving
rising.
and
There is a
things.
lot of hellish imagery there. It refers to an oven, I believe, as well. Or a furnace or
I think the
something like
Jim Carrey film does a much better version than obviously the Muppets, which is Marley and Marley. But the Jim Carrey version, like when he
Yeah.
you hear that clanking, it's quite scary, isn't it?
Oh,
And his jaw
absolutely.
falls
So
out.
the noise, I think, is really clever in that part of because he hears it first. I think building up tension,
It's
the way
coming.
Dickens does that is very clever. He uses sound quite a lot in this novel.
He does.
Chimes of the bells.
Well, and also I think it
And-
has to
and
be the
hearing that.
senses because Scrooge doesn't believe it.
And Scrooge does
And
chooses.
he
Yeah.
really thinks about it. He really tries everything to ignore it. So he sees the knocker, freaks out, ignores it.
Because Scrooge, you could argue, is blind. He's blind to whatever because he's so blinded by ignorance. He won't believe what he sees. He ignores the things that he sees. He's going to have to be shown in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he ignores the fire that turns into his face and the tiles all around the fire changing as well. And it's not until the sound happens and then Marley physically arrives at the door that he's able to be like, okay, what's going on here? And even throughout that whole exchange with Marley, he's like, is this like really Jacob? Like, do I have to do this? And he's half the time he's quite commanding, but the other half he's quite like, oh, really? Like, come on, it can't be that bad. But you had your money, like, you know, you had good business. And then Marley's all like, mankind should have been my business.
And then he looks out the window and there's all those other ghosts, like desperately reaching, desperately
it's
trying to do well.
it's not just Marley saying,
It's society.
saying that. You can see everybody. So
Well,
it has to
Marley
be-
and Scrooge, I think it's really interesting that that Dickens uses they're one and the same, and then the same name.
Oh, he goes by
he
Marley's
goes by
name at
Marley,
the start,
and even the
doesn't
way
he?
when they see his face, he says it was Marley's face, the same face, because that can also be interpreted as his own face. They are synonymous. They're the same thing. They both are the negative part of society. They could be much for muchness, really. And Marley's trying to save Scrooge because they are the same.
I like the idea that Marley's been there for a while. This
7
is just
years.
the first. Well, no, he's been with Scrooge a while, but this is just the first time Scrooge has seen him, which lends into the idea: would Scrooge have been is Scrooge dying
Yeah.
in that moment, and he is redeemed?
Yeah.
Whereas maybe Marley wasn't.
No.
Either way, it makes for a really interesting start because by the end of the stave, Scrooge has not. If he's changed at all, it is minimal. It's more just like okay, this is going to happen.
Well, he's
But
not-
even still, he's like,
not
no.
able to say bar humbug. He says
That's
bah,
true.
but then he can't go for the humbug.
He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable.
Is
Yeah.
humbug kind of meaning nonsense, really?
Yeah.
And so he's not able to declare something to be untrue and nonsense anymore, like he did with Christmas. He's kind of believing that this ghost thing
Well,
might be.
the lack of words as well. I know we're skipping ahead a tiny bit, but the lack of words kind of fits into Stave 3 when he can't choke out that those kids are fine children. It's because he can't be party to that lie anymore. So this might be the small change in the Lexis of the story that might link to us that he
So
might
it's
be
like
changing.
He doesn't have the words to be good. Or express positive thought.
No,
so when it
he's
comes
lost
to
that.
it, he reverts to not saying anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
there's a
If
lot
I was,
to unpack
if I was
there.
Marley though, I'd be a bit annoyed that no ghosts came and warned me.
But maybe they did, and he didn't listen.
He didn't listen, right?
So he died and took this fate.
Yeah. And now he's attempting to sort Scrooge
Maybe
out.
this is
Yeah.
almost a message of this is what will happen right before you die. You will
Yeah.
be visited by a ghost to warn you and see if you can atone for your sins.
Well, again, coming down to judgment. Can you make right? Can you be in the green instead of the red? Like, it is very much.
Yeah.
Could you imagine that the night before you die and like a spectre of like your head of year arrives, like
22 behavior points and no conduct points.
and you can't go to prom.
Yeah, literally it.
Wonderful.
Heavy chains.
Nice little section about Scrooge and his acquaintances. Okay. And the final bit of this podcast is to talk you through the big ideas or the big themes that are really present and really why Dickens did this, why he presented Scrooge in this way and why he's putting it in there. Why do you think he presented Scrooge like this at the beginning?
You got to have those setups to pay off later. We have to hate him. Much like Marley is repeated at the beginning. Marley is dead. Marley is dead. It's important that you know Marley is dead. He's kind of doing that exact same thing, but with Scrooge. He's saying, you know, he's miserable. He's horrible. He's miserable. Look how terrible he is. He's miserable. He's horrible. So that we can see that change. We have that contrast later on. We know how far he's actually come. Okay, so we have to believe him to be a horrible character at the beginning in order for us to actually understand and feel good about his recovery, I guess, at the end of the book.
And ultimately, Dickens is showing how the kind of worst kind of guy can redeem themselves.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think it's an incredibly hopeful story. I find it emotional that it essentially is a story about the ability to redeem yourself,
One last
no
chance.
matter how kind of bad and selfish you've been. It's beautiful, really.
Is it? I can't remember. Implied that if Scrooge does make the changes and becomes a better man, his chains will be gone, lighter, or that he just won't add to them. I can't remember. I thought it was that he would lose his chains.
I think it's to lose as well. I don't feel like it's...
I don't know whether they say that because he said that
I can't remember.
his chains are already very long, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just imagine he can't make it any worse.
I think it'd be a bit bad if he spent the rest of his life being really good and then he ended up just with some half-length
But
chains.
again, it's this idea of asking for forgiveness and being redeemed in the eyes of the Lord. Like you...
yeah.
I think he would lose
He
his
would
chains.
lose
wouldn't
the
he? He would
chains,
lose
yeah.
his chains.
I
to
think
ascend.
I think he'd probably lose his chains because he'd redeem himself. He'd do all that marvellous things.
Well, and one of the big themes is Christianity in Stave 1, like what it means to be a good Christian. And, you know, people would genuinely be terrified of the prospect of not going to heaven. You know, we're living in a deeply religious society. The Victorian era, heavily based on having faith and going to church. And I can never say the word Sabbatarianism. Going to church on a Sunday, which we know Dickens was critical of. But, you know, and then you've got Scrooge, a man who at the end of the novel will go to church, which is quite an interesting
novelty
turn.
for him.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's almost like it's so much to be saying the right things and having your religious idols around your fireplace
you don't
is
act
another
that
if
way.
you don't act on them.
Yeah. I think you
that's
were right.
true.
We were talking a little bit about the poetry, which you're not going to study year 11s, but you will study year 10s. The idea that Blake, around the same time, is writing London, and he's talking about the blackening churches and things like that. And it's really calling out that religion because they're not having that love thy neighbour
Well, it's
kind
just
of
stuff
attitude.
like, I mean, William Blake, won't go into it. Go listen to the Blake podcast, you'll hear more. But he was very critical of child labour in the church, and it's like the chimney sweepers cry and every blackening church appalls. It's like, oh, well, you're allowing this to happen. You're kind of saying like, oh, poor children, poor child labour, but at the same time you're allowing it and you're not
Yeah.
stepping in. And as much as nowadays we might look at the church and go, well, what influence do they have necessarily? But they do, and they did, because church was an institution where you would learn your lessons and you would go every week.
Morality.
And you would trust and you would have faith in. So it's definitely a key theme of the first chapter.
Yeah, and you can't ignore as well that linked into that comes with poverty.
Yeah, and charity.
And charity as well. I mean, all three of them are linked. But the idea that Scrooge has such a negative reaction to the poor. And also having the poor represented with Bob. Like, he is there in the scene. He doesn't have a lot to say.
He's barely even called Bob. I mean, in the opening
he's called
of
the
bit, he's
clerk.
just called the clerk all the time, isn't he? So
Yeah.
I think metaphorically, Scrooge keeps the coals in his room. It's just showing how society keeps what the poor need away from them, and they're able to help them, but actively do
and
not.
at the same
The
time
choice,
stockpile
is
their own. So like Scrooge is a stockpile of coal, but he gives Bob basically one, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I think you see the whole story in the coal, and at the end, I think he tells Bob to light a fire. in
Yeah,
Stave
to
5.
get more coal.
So
Go
there's-
buy more, actually, he
There's,
says.
there's so many parallels, isn't there, with Stave 5, that Dickens sets up all of these things. So structurally, as a whole, the novel fits together, and we have
It's
that
a lovely
it's
little
perfect.
sandwich.
that circular So what? Circular structure?
I said it's like a little sandwich, like little bookends. Like you've got
Yeah.
Stave 1 and Stave 5. And they're almost the opposites of each other.
Oh, my favourite
Like a
thing
Christmas
about
cracker.
well, my favourite thing about Stave 1 and Stave 5 is Stave 1 you've got solitary as an oyster, hard and sharp as a flint, those two similes, and at the end you have happy as an angel, merry as a schoolboy.
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
literally translate the similes from negative to positive.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So that's all set up very, very positively. Also, of course, there's Christmas spirit as well,
Yeah.
which Fred, he's
Fred
very
is-
much embodies Christmas spirit.
I love reading the Fred bits with your class because you suddenly feel everyone being a bit like, oh, Christmassy.
Yeah.
I've actually recorded a song on the Little Lang Gang.
It's the first video that ever went up on this channel.
It is, yeah. Check it out.
Merry
It's-
Christmas, Uncle.
Yeah, it's
brilliant, it's
super
wonderful.
mediocre. It's really.
It's not super mediocre. It's
It was
cheery.
better than your 30-second summary.
I'll tell you, yeah, that's better than that.
Yeah, we had time to prepare for the song.
Achievement.
Either way, thank you so much for listening, Year 10 and 11. Hopefully you found this useful. Like I say, this week, Stave 1, next week, Stave 2, and we're going to keep to this same format of Scrooge and acquaintances and then the big ideas. We will see you next week where we'll be talking about the ghost of Christmas past. Thanks for listening, guys.
See ya.
Good afternoon.
Little Lang Gang.